I didn't cry when my adoptive mother told me I had ruined her life. I laughed. The sound surprised even me, a hollow thing that echoed off the sterile walls of the hospital room where Margaret lay propped against pillows, her white hair sparse from chemo, her eyes still sharp enough to cut. Beside her, Richard clutched her hand like she might dissolve to let go, his expression a mixture of grief and the same vague discomfort he'd always shown in my presence, as if I were a letter that had arrived at the wrong address. "I'm dying, Vanessa," Margaret continued, her voice reedy but relentless. "And you're still trying to punish me for things that happened decades ago. Can't you find it in your heart to what?" I interrupted, still standing in the doorway. I hadn't been invited to sit. I hadn't been invited at all. The only reason I knew about the cancer was because my younger brother, Derek, had called me after 3 years of silence, his voice strange and hollow. "She's asking for you," he'd said. That was it. No context. No apology. Just those 4 words, like they explained everything. Margaret's lips thinned. To be a daughter. To show some compassion. "I took you in when you had nothing. When your own mother—" "Don't." The word came out harder than I intended, but I didn't take it back. "Don't you dare bring her into this." The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Richard cleared his throat, his universal signal for discomfort, and looked anywhere but at me. Margaret's eyes glittered with something I couldn't name. Not regret. Not quite anger. Something older and more complicated. "I'm not here because I want to be," I said finally. "Derek asked me to come. Where's he, by the way? I thought he'd be here." Margaret's expression flickered. "Derek has his own issues to work through. He'll be by later." Something about the way she said it made me pause. But I'd spent 32 years learning not to read between the lines of Margaret Holloway's carefully constructed sentences. The subtext was always the same. "You're not enough. You never were. Why can't you be more like your brother?" "I should go," I said, already turning. "Vanessa, wait." Margaret's voice cracked slightly, and against my better judgment, I stopped. "I know we haven't always seen eye to eye, but you're still my daughter. You'll always be my daughter. And when I'm gone, I want you to know that I did love you, in my own way." It was the closest thing to an apology I'd ever received from her. It should have meant something. Maybe, in another universe, it would have, but I'd spent too many years starving on crumbs to be satisfied with one now. "Goodbye, Margaret," I said, and walked out without looking back. I was 7 years old when my world ended the first time. My biological parents, Elena and David Chun, died in a car accident on a rainy Tuesday night in October. I remember the police officer's face, the way his mustache twitched when he tried to explain what had happened in terms a child could understand. I remember my grandmother's wails echoing through our small apartment, a sound so primal and raw that 30 years later I can still hear it in my nightmares. What I don't remember is anyone asking me what I wanted. Within a month, I was shuffled into the care of my parents' closest friends, Margaret and Richard Holloway. They'd known my parents since college, had been at their wedding, had posed for photos at my first birthday party. They seemed like the obvious choice, the safe choice. The couple with a stable marriage in the nice house in the suburbs, and the son, who was just a year younger than me, who might benefit from having a sister. Derek will be so excited to have a big sister. Margaret had told me on the drive to their house, her voice bright and performative in a way that even my 7-year-old self recognized. We're going to be one big, happy family. I wanted to believe her. God, how I wanted to believe her. For the first 2 years, it wasn't terrible. Margaret was distant but not cruel. Richard was kind in a distracted way. The kind of man who remembered to ask about your day, but not what you'd actually said. Derek was a chubby, cheerful toddler who followed me around and wanted to play with whatever I was playing with. I miss my parents with an ache that never fully receded, but I learned to push it down, to bury it beneath schoolwork and piano lessons and the careful performance of being a good daughter. Then, when I was 9, Margaret got pregnant. I remember the night they told us. Richard made a special dinner, his attempt at celebration, always awkward but sincere, and Margaret kept touching her stomach like it held the secret to everything. Derek was too young to understand, but he clapped when we clapped, his face alight with the joy of being included. "We're going to have another baby," Margaret announced, her eyes shining. "A real baby. Can you believe it? A real baby." The words lodged in my chest like splinters. I didn't know then what they meant. I learned. The pregnancy was difficult. Margaret was in her late 30s, and her body struggled with the demands of carrying another child. She was tired all the time, sick most mornings, irritable in the afternoons. I learned to be quiet, to stay out of the way, to make myself small. When the baby finally came, a boy they named Christopher, after Margaret's father, I thought things might get better. They got worse. Christopher was colicky and demanding, the kind of baby who screamed for hours for no discernible reason and slept only when held. Margaret devoted herself to him completely, her attention a spotlight that never wavered. Richard helped when he could, but he was working long hours to support their growing family. Derek, at 5, was old enough to feel the shift, but too young to understand it. He started acting out, throwing tantrums, wetting the bed. I was the one who cleaned him up, who read him stories when our parents were too exhausted to care, who held him when he cried, and told him everything would be okay. I was 10 years old, and I was already learning to parent children who weren't mine. As Christopher grew, the pattern solidified. He was the golden child, the miracle baby, the son they'd always wanted. Everything he did was remarkable. His first word was celebrated like a major achievement. His first steps were videotaped and shown to anyone who would watch. When he started school and proved to be average at best, Margaret hired tutors. When he struggled to make friends, she organized playdates and forced other children to include him. Meanwhile, I existed in the margins. I was a straight-A student, but my report cards earned a distracted good job before the conversation shifted to Christopher's latest accomplishment. I won the school spelling bee in 7th grade and came home to an empty house because Margaret had taken Christopher to his piano lesson. I got a scholarship to a prestigious summer program and was told it was too expensive for them to help with travel costs, even though they just paid for Christopher to attend a soccer camp he quit after 2 weeks. I learned to stop expecting anything. The trust fund was something my biological grandparents had established before they died. My mother's parents, whom I barely remembered, had set aside money for my future. College, a house, whatever I might need. Margaret and Richard mentioned it occasionally when I was young, always in vague terms. Your grandparents wanted you to have a good life. They'd say. They made sure you'd be taken care of. When I turned 18 and asked about it, the subject became strangely difficult to discuss. "We'll talk about it when you're older," Margaret said, not meeting my eyes. "It's complicated," Richard added, which was his way of saying he didn't want to deal with it. I was too focused on survival to push. I'd moved out the day after graduation, taking a job at a coffee shop and renting a room in a shared house with 3 other people. Community college was all I could afford, but I didn't complain. I was free. That was enough. For a while. The news about Margaret's cancer came 6 months before the hospital confrontation. Derek called me on a Tuesday evening, his voice tight with something I couldn't identify. "She's sick," he said. No preamble, no small talk. "It's bad. The doctors give her maybe a year." I sat down heavily on my couch, the phone pressed to my ear. "I'm sorry to hear that." "That's it? That's all you have to say?" "What do you want me to say, Derek?" "We haven't spoken in 3 years." You made it pretty clear you didn't want me in your life. Silence. Then quieter. Things are complicated. They always were. I didn't go to the hospital that first time. Or the second. Margaret and I had existed in a state of cold détente for so long that I couldn't imagine breaking it now. Not even for cancer. But Derek kept calling, kept pushing, kept saying things like, "She's your mother," and "You'll regret it if you don't come," until finally, out of exhaustion more than anything else, I agreed. That first visit was exactly as awful as I'd expected. Margaret, pale and thin but still sharp-tongued, spent the first 15 minutes reminiscing about my childhood in terms that bore no resemblance to reality. "You were always so difficult," she said at one point, shaking her head. "So moody, I never knew what to do with you." I'd smiled tightly and said nothing. Richard hovered in the corner, looking uncomfortable. Derek arrived halfway through, hugged Margaret with genuine affection, and barely glanced in my direction. Christopher wasn't there. He was busy with work, which I later learned meant he was on a ski trip in Colorado with friends. The visit lasted 45 minutes. I left feeling hollowed out and furious at myself for coming at all. The second visit was the one where I laughed in her face. Between those two visits, something happened that changed everything. A conversation with my aunt, my biological mother's sister, who'd kept in touch over the years despite Margaret's obvious disapproval, brought the trust fund back into focus. "Have you ever looked into it?" Aunt Patricia asked during one of our occasional phone calls. We weren't close, not really, but she was the only connection I had to my real family, and I treasured those calls more than I ever admitted. "Looked into what?" "The money your grandparents left. Your mother always worried about it. You know, she didn't trust Margaret to handle it properly." I frowned. "What do you mean?" Patricia hesitated. "I don't want to cause trouble, sweetheart, but your grandparents were specific about how that money should be used. They wanted it to go to you directly when you turned 18. College, a house, whatever you needed. They didn't intend for anyone else to have control over it." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Margaret and Richard were the trustees. "I know, and I know they had access to it while you were growing up. I always wondered if they used it the way they were supposed to." That conversation sent me down a rabbit hole. I contacted lawyers, requested documents, pieced together a paper trail that spanned decades. What I found made me physically ill. The trust fund had been established with $200,000, a significant sum, carefully invested to grow over time. By the time I turned 18, it should have been worth nearly $300,000. Instead, it had been drained completely by the time I was 16. The money had been used for Christopher's private school tuition, for his orthodontics, for his summer camps and music lessons, and the car he got when he turned 16, for his college education, all 4 years, paid in full, at a private university that cost $50,000 a year. I'd worked my way through community college, then transferred to a state school, graduating with $40,000 in student loans that I was still paying off. I'd lived in cramped apartments and eaten ramen for months at a time. I deferred my dreams of graduate school because I couldn't afford it. And all along, the money my grandparents had left for me had been funding Christopher's charmed life. The rage that filled me was unlike anything I'd ever felt. It was cold and clean and absolutely clarifying. I sued them. The lawsuit became public knowledge within weeks. Local news picked it up. Adopted daughter sues parents over misused trust fund. And suddenly I was getting calls from reporters, from people who'd read the story online, from strangers who wanted to share their own stories of family betrayal. Most of it I ignored. But I couldn't ignore the call from Christopher. He found me through my work email, just like Derek had. But unlike Derek, Christopher didn't ask to meet. He just wrote, "I need to talk to you. It's important." Please. I almost deleted it. Christopher and I had never been close. He was 10 years younger than me, and by the time he was old enough to have real conversations, I'd already moved out. To me, he'd always been the golden child, the reason I'd been pushed aside, the living embodiment of everything I'd lost. It wasn't his fault. I knew that intellectually, but knowing and feeling are different things. Still, curiosity won. I agreed to meet him at a coffee shop near my apartment. He was 22 now, a recent college graduate with his whole life ahead of him. He looked nervous when he walked in, scanning the room until his eyes landed on me. For a moment, we just looked at each other. Two strangers who'd grown up in the same house, but never really known each other. "Thanks for coming," he said, sliding into the seat across from me. "I wasn't sure you would." "I wasn't sure I would either." He laughed, a short, humorless sound. "Fair enough." We ordered coffee. We made small talk about nothing. And then, finally, Christopher took a deep breath and said what he'd come to say. I didn't know about the money. I stared at him. "I mean it," he continued, rushing now. "I had no idea. Mom always told me they were paying for everything themselves. She made it sound like a sacrifice, like they were working extra hours and cutting back on things so I could have opportunities." I believed her. "You believed her," I repeated flatly. "I know how that sounds." "I know." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of pure frustration. "But you have to understand, she's been lying to me my whole life. About everything. Not just the money." I waited. "Remember when I was in high school and I broke my leg playing soccer?" Vaguely. I'd been in college by then, buried in my own problems. I remember Mom calling to tell me. "Yeah, well, what she didn't tell you was that I broke it because I was trying to impress her. She'd been pushing me so hard. Vanessa, grades, sports, friends, everything. Nothing I did was ever good enough. That day, I'd had a bad game. She was in the stands, and I could see her face, this look she gets when she's disappointed. I pushed myself too hard trying to make up for it, and ended up with a compound fracture. I didn't know what to say. This wasn't the Christopher I remembered. The golden boy, the favorite, the one who could do no wrong. "It got worse after that," he continued. "The pressure, the expectations. She had this whole plan for my life, and when I started pushing back, when I said I didn't want to go to the college she'd picked, that I want to study something different, she lost it, accused me of being ungrateful, said everything she'd done was for me and I was throwing it away. And your dad? Dad just goes along with whatever she says. Always has." He shook his head. "I moved out as soon as I graduated. Took a job in another state. I don't call. I don't visit. I can't. I thought about Derek, about the strange phone call that had brought me back into this mess. Does Derek know all this?" "I think so. We've talked a few times. He's got his own stuff with him." Christopher met my eyes for the first time since we'd sat down. "I'm not asking you to forgive me. Vanessa, I know I benefited from what they did, even if I didn't know about it. But I wanted you to hear it from me. And I wanted you to know that if you need me to testify or something, I will. That surprised me. You do that. They stole from you. They lied to me. Someone needs to tell the truth." The court date was set for 6 months out. In the meantime, life continued. I went to work, paid my bills, tried not to think too hard about the upcoming confrontation. Christopher and I started talking more. Texts at first, then phone calls, then actual visits. It was strange, building a relationship with someone I'd known my whole life, but never really met. But it was also good, healing, in a way I hadn't expected. Derek, meanwhile, remained distant. He'd stopped returning my calls after the hospital visit, And when I reached out to ask why, he sent a one-line text. I can't do this right now. I didn't push. We all had our own ways of coping. The wedding came 3 months before the court date. Christopher was marrying his girlfriend, Maya, a warm, funny woman who'd somehow survived his mother's disapproval and emerged with her spirit intact. They'd planned a small ceremony at a park, followed by a reception at a local hall. When Christopher asked me to be there, not just as a guest, but as his sister, as family, I cried for the first time in years. The day was beautiful, sunny and warm, with just enough breeze to keep the heat from being oppressive. Maya looked stunning in her simple white dress, and Christopher couldn't stop smiling. I stood with the other guests, watching them exchange vows, and felt something loosen in my chest. Maybe we could do this. Maybe we could actually be a family. The reception was in full swing when Margaret showed up. I saw her before anyone else did, a flash of familiar white blonde hair at the edge of the parking lot, moving with determination toward the hall. My heart dropped into my stomach. I grabbed Christopher's arm. She's here. His face went pale. Then, slowly, something hardened in his expression. Stay here, he said. I'll handle it. I watched him walk toward the entrance, his posture stiff with barely controlled anger. Margaret was already arguing with the security guard Christopher had hired specifically for this purpose, her voice carrying on the warm evening air. I'm his mother. You can't keep me out. Christopher reached them and said something I couldn't hear. Margaret's face crumpled. She started talking faster, gesturing wildly, and for a moment I thought she might actually push past the guard and force her way inside. Then Christopher said something else, and she stopped. Just stopped, like a clock that had run down. He turned and walked back toward the reception without looking at her. After a long moment, Margaret got back in her car and drove away. What did you say to her? I asked when he reached me. He shook his head. Doesn't matter. She's gone. That's what matters. We didn't talk about it again that night. But later, when I was driving home, I got a text from an unknown number. It was a photo, Margaret and Richard, standing outside the reception hall, their faces twisted with anger and something that looked almost like despair. The caption read, "This is your fault. You destroyed this family." I blocked the number and kept driving. The court date arrived faster than I expected. I'd spent months preparing, working with my lawyer, gathering evidence, bracing myself for the confrontation to come. But nothing could have prepared me for the reality of walking into that courtroom and seeing Margaret and Richard sitting at the defendant's table, looking older and smaller than I remembered. Margaret had lost more weight. Her skin had a grayish pallor that spoke to the cancer eating her from the inside. Richard looked defeated, his shoulders slumped, his eyes fixed on the table in front of him. For a moment, just a moment, I felt a flicker of something that might have been pity. Then I remembered the money, the lies, the decades of being treated like I didn't matter. The pity died. The proceedings were straightforward. My lawyer presented the evidence. Bank records showing the trust fund withdrawals, correspondence proving Margaret and Richard had acted as trustees, documentation of how the money had been spent. Their lawyer argued that they'd use the fund for household expenses that benefited me as well, but the records told a different story. The money had gone to Christopher's private school, Christopher's summer camps, Christopher's college tuition. I'd been 18 by the time most of it was spent, already supporting myself, already invisible to them. The turning point came when Christopher took the stand. I watched Margaret's face as he was sworn in, saw the hope flicker there. She still thought he might save her, still thought her golden child would come through. Then he started talking. He told the court about the pressure he'd felt growing up, the constant push to be perfect, the way Margaret had controlled every aspect of his life. He talked about discovering the truth about the trust fund. Not from her, but from me, when I'd reached out after years of silence. He described the guilt he felt, knowing that his privileged childhood had been funded by money that should have been mine. I didn't know, he said, his voice steady. But I should have. I should have asked questions. I should have wondered why my parents could afford things they'd never been able to afford before. I was selfish and blind, and I'm sorry. Margaret's face went through a series of transformations. Hope to confusion to disbelief to something that looked almost like betrayal. When Christopher finished and stepped down, she was crying. Not the performative tears I'd seen from her before, but real ones, ugly and raw. Richard just looked old. The verdict came 3 weeks later. The judge ruled in my favor, ordering Margaret and Richard to repay the full amount of the trust fund, plus interest and legal fees. It was a sum that would bankrupt them, force them to sell their house, liquidate their retirement accounts, possibly declare bankruptcy. I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I just felt tired. Margaret died 6 months after the verdict. The cancer spread faster than anyone expected, and by the end, she was barely a shadow of the woman who'd raised me. Richard called to tell me, his voice hollow with grief. She asked for you at the end, he said. Wanted to see you one last time. I didn't go. I told myself it was because I was done with her, because she'd made her choices, and I'd made mine. But the truth was simpler. I was afraid. Afraid that if I saw her dying, I'd forgive her. Afraid that all my carefully constructed anger would crumble, and I'd be left with nothing but grief for a mother I'd never really had. Richard died 8 months later. Heart attack, they said. Grief, I thought. The funeral was small. Derek and Christopher and me, standing in a cemetery on a gray November day, watching 2 caskets lowered into ground. We didn't speak much. There wasn't much to say. Afterward, we went to a diner near the cemetery and sat in a booth, drinking coffee and not talking. Finally, Derek broke the silence. I should have stood up for you, he said, not looking at me. All those years, I should have said something. Why didn't you? He shrugged, a helpless gesture. I don't know. Fear, I guess. She was so... I don't know how to explain it. She had this way of making you feel like you were wrong, no matter what, like your reality wasn't real. I thought about that. Thought about all the years I'd spent questioning myself, wondering if I was imagining the slights, the neglect, the casual cruelty. Margaret had been a master of gaslighting long before the term became popular. She'd made me doubt my own memories, my own feelings, my own worth. She's gone now, Christopher said quietly. Both of them. We're all that's left. We sat with that for a while. The 3 of us, strangers who share blood and history and trauma, trying to figure out what came next. It's been 2 years since the verdict. 2 years since Margaret and Richard died. 2 years of rebuilding, reconnecting, reimagining what family means. Christopher and Maya had a baby last spring, a little girl they named Elena, after our mother. I'm her godmother. I see her at least once a week, watching her grow, teaching her the songs my mother used to sing to me. It hurts, sometimes, remembering, but it's also beautiful. Derek finally went to therapy. He calls me now, actually calls, and we talk about our lives, our work, our struggles. He's dating someone new, a woman who apparently has a terrible relationship with her own family, and they bond over it. We're starting our own tradition, he told me recently. Thanksgiving with people who actually want to be there. The money from the lawsuit paid off my student loans and bought a small house, nothing fancy, but mine. I put the rest into a savings account, earmarked for future needs. Graduate school, maybe. Or a trip somewhere I've always wanted to go. Or just a cushion, a safety net, the kind of security I'd never had before. Sometimes, late at night, I think about Margaret, about the woman who took me in, and then pushed me away, who raised me and neglected me in equal measure. I try to understand her, to find some explanation that makes sense of it all. But the truth is, I don't think there is one. She was complicated and broken and capable of both love and cruelty, just like most people, just like all of us. The difference is that I got to choose what to do with that knowledge. I chose to let go, not forgive. I'm not sure I'll ever fully forgive, but let go, to stop carrying the weight of her choices, her failures, her love that came with too many conditions, to focus instead on the family I'm building now, the connections I'm nurturing, the future I'm creating. Christopher texted me this morning. Elena said her first word. Guess what it was? I texted back. What? His response came immediately. Nessa. She said Nessa. I sat with my phone in my hand, tears streaming down my face, and felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Hope.